The sun had barely risen when I got the call from my neighbor. The river that skirted our neighborhood had crept over its banks overnight. My stomach sank. This wasn't just rainwater. It was the swollen aftermath of a week-long storm, the kind that usually sent the local news scrambling for footage. I grabbed my raincoat and boots, praying the flood wall I'd spent months building in my backyard would hold. Weeks earlier, the HOA board had called it a joke. I'd pitched the idea at the monthly meeting, modular steel panels, sandbags, reinforced concrete, but they laughed. One board member even smirked and said, "Are you building a wall or a sculpture?" I tried to explain the physics, the risk, the inevitability of heavy storms in this region. But my warnings fell on deaf ears. They wanted curb appeal, not safety. I returned home, checking the wall for leaks. Everything seemed tight, though the water level was already lapping at the base. I could see my neighbor, Mr. Andrews, frantically moving his patio furniture to the second floor. He had dismissed my wall entirely. He didn't believe in precaution. Watching him now, I wondered if laughter would turn to regret before the day ended. The sky darkened further as clouds rolled in like a warning. I heard the distant roar of the river gaining momentum. My heart pounded in rhythm with the water hammering against the embankment. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. Another message from the HOA group chat. "Hey, is your wall, actually doing anything?" one member wrote, a tone that was equal parts mocking and incredulous. I typed back a single word, "Watch." Minutes later, it began. The first gush of water struck the streets like a battering ram. I could see the HOA president, Ms. Clark, running through her front door, phone pressed to her ear, eyes wide with panic. The very street she'd ignored in my proposal was now turning into a torrent. Cars floated past in a surreal parade of chaos, and the HOA board members scattered, some screaming, others trying to salvage their prized lawn decor. I stood behind my wall, heart racing but strangely calm. The rain poured, the river roared, and yet nothing breached my defense. Water splashed against the steel panels and rose in a steady rhythm. Behind me, my neighbors were being swept into a frenzy, rushing to higher ground, realizing too late that their decorative choices weren't prepared for nature's fury. And then came the knock on my door. I opened it to find Ms. Clark soaked to the bone, mascara streaked, trembling. We didn't believe it would work," she admitted, voice shaking. "Your wall, it actually held." I nodded silently, letting the water crash around us, knowing the joke had finally been revealed. At their expense. This is Chapter 1. Each chapter will be roughly 470 words like this. The chaos outside my wall was like something out of a disaster movie. Water surged down the streets, carrying trash bins, garden chairs, and even a stray lawn gnome into the maelstrom. I watched the HOA board, dripping wet and wide-eyed, attempting to coordinate with emergency services over glitchy cell signals. Their panic was palpable, utterly different from the smugness they had worn just weeks before when dismissing my flood wall. I opened the back gate slightly to assess the water's force. It slammed against the wall with the pressure of a freight train, but the panels held. My makeshift drainage system was doing its job, diverting excess runoff toward the reinforced canal behind my property. Every time the river surged, I could hear the hollow echo against the steel, a rhythmic pounding that somehow reassured me more than it should have. I caught sight of Mr. Andrews attempting to rescue his dog from the rising water. He slipped on the muddy curb, nearly falling in, but somehow managed to grab the leash just in time. I hollered advice from behind my wall, but he waved me off with a nervous laugh. Clearly, ego was still clouding judgment even as floodwater crept dangerously close. Meanwhile, the HOA board had assembled under a small, dripping awning, clutching their phones and muttering to each other. I could overhear snippets of their conversation. "This isn't possible. It's supposed to be a joke," one man hissed. "We should have listened," muttered another, her voice breaking. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. Seeing them humbled was one thing. Witnessing real fear in their eyes was another. The wall had worked, But the storm wasn't finished yet. Rain kept pounding, turning the streets into rivers. I knew if my reinforcement failed now, the entire neighborhood could face catastrophic flooding. My phone buzzed again. This time a text from the HOA president, Ms. Clark. "Can you help us? Please." I hesitated. Pride whispered no, but humanity demanded yes. I grabbed my waterproof boots and walked to the nearest street corner where water had pooled dangerously near her home. Step by step, I guided her and two other board members toward the highest point in my yard, showing them how to avoid the strong current and deep pockets of rushing water. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with the realization that every decision had consequences, and not every joke was harmless. Once they were safely behind the wall, I allowed myself a moment to look back at the neighborhood. The river had already claimed the lower streets. Cars floated like toys, and garden sheds had become miniature boats. Yet here, in this small, fortified backyard, everything was dry. Ms. Clark, drenched and shivering, looked at me with a mixture of fear, respect, and guilt. I never imagined this would actually work," she admitted. You saved our homes." I didn't answer. Words felt unnecessary. The storm was teaching lessons that laughter could not. And as the rain continued to pour, I realized that my wall was more than steel and concrete. It was a line between preparation and disaster, between foresight and foolishness. The storm showed no sign of slowing. By mid-morning, the wind had joined the rain, whipping the surface of the river into frothy whitecaps. Streets that were once familiar and safe had become chaotic torrents, with water rushing over curbs and splashing against walls. From behind my flood barrier, I could see the full extent of the damage. Cars were stranded in swirling water, mailboxes bent or submerged, and trees uprooted by the combination of wind and saturated soil. The HOA board had huddled in a corner of my yard, still shivering but finally paying attention. Ms. Clark paced nervously, muttering apologies. We should have listened. We laughed at you. How did you know?" Her voice was raw, almost pleading. I explained calmly, showing them the drainage channels I'd installed and how the reinforced panels were anchored into the ground. I pointed to the slight slope of my property, designed to divert water away from the wall and prevent it from toppling. Some of the board members took notes as if attending an impromptu engineering class, though I suspected panic had more to do with their attention than genuine curiosity. Meanwhile, water continued to rise in the streets beyond my wall. Mr. Andrews, who had been reluctantly watching from his second-floor balcony, shouted down for help rescuing a stranded neighbor. I grabbed a rope and tied it to a secure post in my yard, giving them a lifeline across the flooded street. Step by step, we managed to pull the elderly man to safety. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made me forget the exhaustion in my arms and legs. As we worked, the HOA president finally spoke words I had longed to hear. "You weren't joking. We mocked you. But your preparation, your foresight, it saved us all. We need to follow your example." I could only nod, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the quiet satisfaction of vindication. Hours passed. Slowly the rain began to ease, though the river's current remained strong. I inspected the wall again, noting minor wear at some joints, but nothing catastrophic. My heart swelled with a mix of relief and pride. The steel held, the concrete resisted, the sandbags had done their job. By the afternoon, the streets were ankle-deep in water, but the immediate threat had passed. The board members, still soaked and shaken, began coordinating emergency relief efforts, setting up temporary shelters and alerting neighbors stranded in flooded areas. For the first time, they were listening rather than dismissing. I stood back and watched them, realizing the storm had taught the HOA a lesson that no meeting or memo could. They had underestimated preparation, mocked caution, and now faced the consequences. But for all their panic, one truth was undeniable. The wall had worked, and it had worked because someone had refused to treat safety as a joke. By late afternoon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the river's furious roar had softened to a steady murmur. The streets remained treacherous, but the worst of the storm had passed. I stepped onto the top of my flood wall, scanning the neighborhood below. The scene was chaotic but survivable. Some yards were flattened, fences twisted, cars stranded, but no one had been swept away thanks to quick thinking and, admittedly, my wall. The HOA board gathered near the edge of my yard, shivering but attentive. There was an awkward silence at first. Ms. Clark finally spoke, her voice quieter than before, but firm. "We, every one of us, underestimated you. We mocked your wall, and now we see why you built it." Her eyes met mine, carrying a mixture of guilt and newfound respect. One by one, the other board members nodded. We need to take precautions seriously from now on," another admitted. "No more ignoring warnings, no more dismissing ideas just because they aren't convenient or pretty." I nodded, realizing that, beyond saving their homes, the wall had achieved something else. It had forced a stubborn group of people to confront their own arrogance. Mr. Andrews approached, dripping wet but sheepish. I should have listened," he muttered. "Your wall. It saved my house, my dog, everything. I thought it was silly. I was wrong." I allowed a small, tight smile. He wasn't the only one learning a lesson, but at least he acknowledged it. We spent the next hour helping neighbors salvage what they could, moving furniture, and marking which areas were unsafe. The water had receded slightly, but the streets were still muddy, and the smell of wet earth and debris hung heavy in the air. Even as the chaos continued, I felt a sense of calm. My wall hadn't just held water, it had held back disaster long enough for people to realize the value of foresight, preparation, and humility. Finally, as the sun peeked through the clouds, I stepped back and surveyed the scene. My backyard was dry, my wall intact, and the neighborhood, though battered, had survived. The HOA board members were busy planning long-term solutions, reinforcing streets, clearing drainage paths, and, for the first time, taking the idea of safety seriously. Ms. Clark approached me again, holding a clipboard this time. "We want you to lead the planning committee," she said. "Not just your wall, but everything. We trust your judgment now." I paused, considering the irony. The same people who had laughed at my design were now asking me to guide the entire neighborhood safety planning. I smiled faintly, thinking of the hours I had spent building, measuring, reinforcing, preparing for the day everyone else had ignored. "All right," I said. "Let's make sure this never happens again." As the sun finally broke through the clouds, glinting off the steel panels of my wall, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The joke was over, the flood had passed, and the lesson had been learned. Sometimes preparation is worth more than laughter, and a little foresight can save more than just homes. It can save pride, trust, and even lives. Enjoying this wild HOA flood story? Hit that subscribe button to catch more real-life survival and prep stories. Give this a like if you were shocked by how the wall held up, and drop a comment below. What would you do if your neighbors ignored a warning like this?